On Ethnocentrism, a reply to Clifford Geertz. In his provocative paper on the uses of diversity, Professor Geertz asserts that ethnocentrism relegates gaps and asymmetries between individuals or groups to a realm of repressible or ignorable difference, mere unlikeness. This is a good description of how we treat people whom we think not worth understanding, those whom we regard as irredeemably crazy, stupid, base, or sinful. Such people are not viewed as possible conversational partners, but at most as means to ends. We think we have nothing to learn from such people, for we would rather die than share the beliefs which we assume are central to their self-identities. Some people think of Jews and atheists in these terms, others think this way about Nazis and religious fundamentalists. When we bourgeois liberals find ourselves thinking of people in this way, when, for example, we find ourselves reacting to the Nazis and the fundamentalists with indignation and contempt, we have to think twice, for we are exemplifying the attitude we claim to despise. We would rather die than be ethnocentric. But ethnocentrism is precisely the conviction that one would rather die than share certain beliefs. We then find ourselves wondering whether our own bourgeois liberalism is not just one more example of cultural bias. This bemusement makes us susceptible to the suggestion that the culture of Western liberal democracy is somehow on a par with that of the Vandals and the Eek. So we begin to wonder whether our attempts to get other parts of the world to adopt our culture are different in kind from the efforts of fundamentalist missionaries. If we continue this line of thought too long, we become what are sometimes called wet liberals. We begin to lose any capacity for moral indignation, any capacity to feel contempt. Our sense of selfhood dissolves. We can no longer feel pride in being bourgeois liberals, in being part of a great tradition, a citizen of no mean culture. We have become so open-minded that our brains have fallen out. This collapse of moral self-confidence, what Geertz calls the desperate tolerance of UNESCO cosmopolitanism, provokes a reaction in the direction of anti-ethnocentrism, the direction exemplified by the passages from Levi-Strauss and myself, which Geertz cites. This in turn provokes Geertz's counter-reaction. He says, for example, any moral philosophy so afraid of becoming entangled in witless relativism or transcendental dogmatism that it can think of nothing better to do with other ways of going at life than make them look worse than our own, is destined merely toward making the world safe for condescension. Geertz fears that if the anti-ethnocentrist reaction goes too far, we shall become content to think of human communities as semantic monads, nearly windowless. Some human communities are such monads, some not. Our bourgeois liberal culture is not. On the contrary, it is a culture which prides itself on constantly adding on more windows, constantly enlarging its sympathies. It is a form of life which is constantly extending pseudopods and adapting itself to what it encounters. Its sense of its own moral worth is founded on its tolerance of diversity. The heroes it apotheosizes include those who have enlarged its capacity for sympathy and tolerance. Among the enemies it diabolizes are the people who attempt to diminish this capacity, the vicious ethnocentrists. Anti-ethnocentrism is not an attempt to change the habits of our culture, to block the windows up again. Rather, it is an attempt to cope with the phenomenon of wet liberalism by correcting our culture's habit of giving its desire for windows a philosophical foundation. Anti-ethnocentrism does not say that we are trapped within our monad or our language, but merely that the well-windowed monad we live in is no more closely linked to the nature of humanity or the demands of rationality than the relatively windowless monads which surround us. I shall enlarge on this latter point later, but first I should like to comment on Geertz's case of the drunken Indian and the kidney machine. This case looks different to me than it does to Geertz, so I shall begin by saying how I see it and then comment on the way Geertz sees it. My own reaction to the case, as Geertz presents it, is that it is not particularly depressing, but rather cheering. It shows our liberal institutions functioning well and smoothly. Geertz says that queuing for the kidney machine was organized in terms of severity of need and order of application. So it should have been. Since, as he says, the Indian was already on the machine by the time the problem became visible, the doctors could not bring themselves to take him off. He then adds in parentheses, Nor, I suppose, would they have been permitted. Indeed, they would not, and this is what I find cheering. If they had tried to take him off the machine, the media and the malpractice lawyers would have been all over them the next day. The whole apparatus of the liberal democratic state, an apparatus to which the press is as central as are the officers of the court, ensured that once the Indian had the sense to get into that queue early, he was going to have more years in which to drink than he would otherwise have had. Geertz says that this was a hard case, and it ended in a hard way. From the legal point of view, surely it was not a hard case. Procedural justice was visibly done, nor does it seem hard from a moral point of view. It is morally satisfying to think that life or death decisions are made on the basis of severity of need and priority of application, rather than, say, on the basis of political or financial clout, family membership, or the sympathies of those present. We take moral pride in the fact that our society hands such decisions over to the mechanisms of procedural justice. Geertz goes on to say that he cannot see that either more ethnocentrism, more relativism, or more neutrality would have made things any better, though more imagination might have. I agree that no philosophical position or strategy could have made things any better, but I am not sure what he thinks imagination could have made better, because I am not sure what needed improvement. I take it that Geertz means that the doctors might have been less upset by the Indian's failure to be a good patient if they had been able to put themselves in the Indian's shoes. But it is not clear that they had any business being so distraught in the first place. We do not really want doctors to differentiate between the values of the lives they are saving, any more than we want defense lawyers to worry too much about the innocence of their clients, or teachers to worry about which students will make the best use of the education they are offering. A society built around procedural justice needs agents who do not look too closely at such matters. Geertz says that nobody in this episode learned very much about either themselves or about anyone else, that the whole thing took place in the dark. At the end of his paper, he suggests that what the doctors lacked was knowledge of the degree to which he, the Indian, has earned his views, and the bitter sense that is therefore in them, and comprehension of the terrible road over which he has had to travel to arrive at them, and of what it is, ethnocentrism and the crimes it legitimates, that has made it so terrible. What Geertz has, and the doctors presumably didn't have, is some knowledge of what it was like to be a member of that Indian's tribe before, during, and after the conquest of that tribe by the whites. I want to make 2 points about this difference between Geertz and the doctors. First, the fact that lots of doctors, lawyers, and teachers are unable to imagine themselves in the shoes of lots of their patients, clients, and students does not show that anything is taking place in the dark. There is light enough for them to get their job done and to do it right. The only sense in which something took place in the dark is the sense in which all human relations, untouched by love, take place in the dark. This is an extended sense of in the dark, analogous to the extended sense of alone, in which we mortal millions live alone. When we gun down the psychopath or send the war criminal to the gallows, we are, in this extended sense, acting in the dark. For if we had watched the war criminal grow up, had travelled the road he had travelled, we might have had difficulty reconciling the demands of love and of justice. But it is well for society that in most cases our ignorance permits us to avoid this dilemma. Most of the time, justice has to be enough. The second and more important point I want to make about Geertz and the doctors is that it is the signal glory of our liberal society that it entrusts power to people like Geertz and his fellow anthropologists, as well as to people like the doctors. Anthropologists, and Geertz's other connoisseurs of diversity, are the people who are expected and empowered to extend the range of society's imagination, thereby opening the doors of procedural justice to people on whom they had been closed. Why is it, after all, that the Indian was ever allowed into the clinic? Why are drunken Indians, in Geertz's words, as much a part of contemporary America as yuppie doctors? Roughly, because anthropologists have made them so. Drunken Indians were more common in America 100 years ago than now, but anthropologists less common. Because of the absence of sympathetic interpreters who could place their behavior in the context of an unfamiliar set of beliefs and desires, drunken Indians were not part of 19th century America. That is, the vast majority of 19th century Americans took no more notice of them than they did of criminal psychopaths or village idiots. The Indians, whether drunk or sober, were non-persons without human dignity, means to our grandparents' ends. The anthropologists made it hard for us to continue thinking of them that way, and thereby made them into part of contemporary America. To be part of a society is, in the relevant sense, to be taken as a possible conversational partner by those who shape that society's self-image. The media, prodded by the intellectuals in general, and the anthropologists in particular, have been making such partners of the Indians. But if the anthropologists had not sympathized with, learned from, even sometimes loved the Indians, Indians would have remained invisible to the agents of social justice. They would never have gotten into the queue in the first place. Now let me draw some conclusions from what I have been saying about Geertz's case. The principal one is that the moral tasks of a liberal democracy are divided between the agents of love and the agents of justice. In other words, such a democracy employs and empowers both connoisseurs of diversity and guardians of universality. The former insist that there are people out there whom society has failed to notice. They make these candidates for admission visible by showing how to explain their odd behavior in terms of a coherent, if unfamiliar, set of beliefs and desires, as opposed to explaining this behavior with terms like stupidity, madness, baseness, or sin. The latter, the guardians of universality, make sure that once these people are admitted as citizens, once they have been shepherded into the light by the connoisseurs of diversity, they are treated just like all the rest of us. Our society's device for resolving what Geertz calls wrenching social issues centered around cultural diversity is simply to keep lots of agents of love, lots of connoisseurs of diversity, on hand. Our society has tacitly given up on the idea that theology or philosophy will supply general rules for resolving such issues. It recognizes that moral progress has, in recent centuries, owed more to the specialists in particularity, historians, novelists, ethnographers, and muckraking journalists, for example, than to such specialists in universality as theologians and philosophers. The formulation of general moral principles has been less useful to the development of liberal institutions than has the gradual expansion of the imagination of those in power, their gradual willingness to use the term we to include more and more different sorts of people. Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England and the writings of people like Harriet, Beecher, Stowe, Fenollosa, and Malinowski did more than Engels' Dialectics of Nature or the writings of Mill or Dewey to justify the existence of the weak outsiders to the powerful insiders. So I am inclined to set aside the questions Geertz poses about the resolution of social issues created by cultural diversity by saying that we should simply keep doing what our liberal society is already in the habit of doing, lending an ear to the specialists in particularity, permitting them to fulfill their function as agents of love, and hoping that they will continue to expand our moral imagination. There is nothing incompatible with this hope in the sort of anti-ethnocentrism Geertz describes. Let me now return to an explicit defense of the anti-ethnocentrism which I sketched earlier. This mini-movement should be seen neither as putting forward a large philosophical view about the nature of culture, nor as recommending a social policy. Rather, it should be seen as an attempt to resolve a small, local, psychological problem. This psychological problem is found only within the souls of bourgeois liberals who have not yet gone postmodern, the ones who are still using the rationalist rhetoric of the Enlightenment to back up their liberal ideals. These liberals hold on to the Enlightenment notion that there is something called a common human nature, a metaphysical substrate in which things called rights are embedded, and that this substrate takes moral precedence over all merely cultural superstructures. Preserving this idea produces self-referential paradox, as soon as liberals begin to ask themselves whether their belief in such a substrate is itself a cultural bias. Liberals who are both connoisseurs of diversity and Enlightenment rationalists cannot get out of this bind. Their rationalism commits them to making sense of the distinction between rational judgment and cultural bias. Their liberalism forces them to call any doubts about human equality a result of such a rational bias. Yet their connoisseurship forces them to realize that most of the globe's inhabitants simply do not believe in human equality, that such a belief is a Western eccentricity. Since they think it would be shockingly ethnocentric to say, so what, we Western liberals do believe in it, and so much the better for us, they are stuck. Anti-ethnocentrists suggest that liberals should say exactly that, and that they should simply drop the distinction between rational judgment and cultural bias. The Enlightenment had hoped that philosophy would both justify liberal ideals and specify limits to liberal tolerance by an appeal to transcultural criteria of rationality. But our philosophers no longer attempt this. They tell us that we are going to have to work out the limits case by case, by hunch or by conversational compromise, rather than by reference to stable criteria. So we postmodernist bourgeois liberals no longer tag our central beliefs and desires as necessary or natural, and our peripheral ones as contingent or cultural. This is partly because the anthropologists, novelists, and historians have done such a good job of exhibiting the contingency of various putative necessities. In part, it is because philosophers like Quine, Wittgenstein, and Derrida have made us wary of the very idea of a necessary contingent distinction. These philosophers describe human life by the metaphor of a continual reweaving of a web of beliefs and desires. Insofar as we adopt this metaphor, we shall regard the web as seamless, in the sense that we shall no longer use epistemological distinctions to divide it. So we no longer think of ourselves as having reliable sources of knowledge, called reason or sensation, nor unreliable ones called tradition or common opinion. We put aside such distinctions as scientific knowledge versus cultural bias, and question of fact versus question of value. The latter distinctions were once used to mark off the beliefs that appeared notably clear and distinct from those that seemed relatively debatable, those about which we self-consciously tried to keep an open mind. But in their absence, it is natural for us to look about for other terms which will serve to mark off, if only temporarily and for certain purposes, the center of our self from its periphery. Typically, the terms we fall back on are self-consciously ethnocentric, being a Christian or an American, or a Marxist or a philosopher, or an anthropologist or a postmodernist bourgeois liberal. In adopting these self-characterizations, we announce to our audience where we are coming from, our contingent spatio-temporal affiliations. To sum up, anti-ethnocentrism should be seen as a protest against the persistence of Enlightenment rhetoric in an era in which our connoisseurship of diversity has made this rhetoric seem self-deceptive and sterile. It is not a reaction against love, or against justice, or against liberal institutions. It is just a bit of ad hoc philosophical therapy, an attempt to cure the cramps caused in liberals by what Bernard Williams calls the rationalist theory of rationality. The idea that you are being irrational, and probably viciously ethnocentric, whenever you cannot appeal to neutral criteria. It urges liberals to take with full seriousness the fact that the ideals of procedural justice and human equality are parochial, recent, eccentric cultural developments, and then to recognize that this does not mean that they are any the less worth fighting for. It urges that ideals may be local and culture-bound, and nevertheless be the best hope of the species. I shall conclude these comments by turning to Geertz's claim that we have come to such a point in the moral history of the world that we are obliged to think about cultural diversity rather differently than we have been used to thinking about it. He develops this point by saying that we are living more and more in the midst of an enormous collage, that the world is coming at each of its local points to look more like a Kuwaiti bazaar than like an English gentleman's club. These latter descriptions seem right to me, but I do not see why Geertz thinks that we bourgeois liberals need to change our thinking about cultural diversity in order to deal with this situation. For this is just the sort of situation that the Western liberal ideal of procedural justice was designed to deal with. John Rawls has remarked that the historical circumstances of the emergence of the Western liberal notion of justice include the development of the principle of religious toleration and the institutions of large market economies. Both sources, he says, spring from and encourage the diversity of doctrines and the plurality of conflicting and indeed incommensurable conceptions of the good affirmed by the members of existing democratic societies. The relevant point is that one does not have to accept much else from Western culture to find the Western liberal ideal of procedural justice attractive. The advantage of postmodernist liberalism is that it recognizes that in recommending that ideal, one is not recommending a philosophical outlook, a conception of human nature, or of the meaning of human life, to representatives of other cultures. All we should do is point out the practical advantages of liberal institutions in allowing individuals and cultures to get along together without intruding on each other's privacy, without meddling with each other's conceptions of the good. We can suggest that UNESCO think about cultural diversity on a world scale in the way our ancestors in the 17th and 18th centuries thought about religious diversity on an Atlantic scale, as something to be simply ignored for purposes of designing political institutions. We can urge the construction of a world order whose model is a bazaar surrounded by lots and lots of exclusive private clubs. Like Geertz, I have never been in a Kuwaiti bazaar, nor in an English gentleman's club, so I can give free rein to my fantasies. I picture many of the people in such a bazaar as preferring to die rather than share the beliefs of many of those with whom they are haggling, yet as haggling profitably away nevertheless. Such a bazaar is obviously not a community, in the strong, approbative sense of community used by critics of liberalism like Alisdair MacIntyre and Robert Bellah. You cannot have an old-timey Gemeinschaft unless everybody pretty well agrees on who counts as a decent human being and who does not. But you can have a civil society of the bourgeois democratic sort. All you need is the ability to control your feelings when people who strike you as irredeemably different show up at the Hôtel de Ville or the greengrocer's or the bazaar. When this happens, you smile a lot, make the best deals you can, and, after a hard day's haggling, retreat to your club. There, you will be comforted by the companionship of your moral equals. Wet liberals will be repelled by this suggestion that the exclusivity of the private club might be a crucial feature of an ideal world order. It will seem a betrayal of the Enlightenment to imagine us as winding up with a world of moral narcissists, congratulating themselves on neither knowing nor caring what the people in the club over on the other side of the bazaar are like. But if we forget about the Enlightenment ideal of the self-realization of humanity as such, we can disassociate liberty and equality from fraternity. If we attend, rather, to the reports of our agents of love, our connoisseurs of diversity, we may agree with Levi Strauss that such exclusivity is a necessary and proper condition of selfhood. By attending to the reports of our agents of justice, we can see how such strong, ethnocentric, exclusivist selves might cooperate in keeping the bazaar open, in keeping the institutions of procedural justice functioning. Putting the two sets of reports together, we realize that the Enlightenment should not have yearned for a world polity whose citizens share common aspirations and a common culture. Then we will not try for a society which makes assent to beliefs about the meaning of human life or certain moral ideals a requirement for citizenship. We will aim at nothing stronger than a commitment to Rawlsian procedural justice, a moral commitment when made by members of some clubs, e.g. ours, but a matter of expediency when made by members of others. The ultimate political synthesis of love and justice may thus turn out to be an intricately textured collage of private narcissism and public pragmatism.